I'm Scott Walker and this is Walks on the Wild Side. In today's video, we're going to talk about how to get sharpness and detail in your macro photography. Welcome back to Walks on the Wild Side, the channel where I help you capture the beauty of nature through your camera lens. So we're going to do some macro photography today because I thought it'd be a great time. There are loads of insects around at the moment, and we're going to talk about how to get both sharpness and detail in your images. I'm going to take a walk through some woods that I know typically have lots of insects, as well as take in a pond and some grassy fields. So let's go. I've reached an area where there are loads of insects around the flowers and leaves on this bush, so I'm going to take a photo. But first, let's talk about the technique for how you can maximise the number of sharp photos that you get, and it's all around how you hold your camera. So the first thing you want to do if you're standing up is make sure your elbows are tucked into your body. If your elbows are out, there's more opportunity for movement, but if they're in, you move less, so that introduces less movement to the camera. If we weren't stood up, if we were on the ground level, I'd either want to kneel down with my elbows into my torso, or be lying on the ground with my elbows out, touching the ground, forming a triangle to keep that camera steady. But as we're standing, elbows into the body. Next thing, how we're going to actually touch the camera. So you're always going to want to have one hand on this side because that's where your shutter is. But where's your other hand go? Now, some people will hold this side of the camera. Some photographers will hold the barrel. I like to have the camera in the palm of my hand. So I rest the camera body on my palm and use the tips of my fingers just to steady the lens. And as you can see, with my arm tucked into my elbow, I can hold that in a really steady position for quite a while, leaving this hand free to press the shutter. So let's get a picture. Now, before we take our photo, I want to make sure that my camera is in manual focus. So hopefully you can see here, manual, I push the focusing ring down and that is in manual focus. If I push it up or outwards, that's in autofocus. So I'm going to leave it down. Now, some cameras, there'll be a switch on the side that allows you to do that, but mine, it's this focusing ring. Now, I want to put my camera into the nearest focusing point that I can. So here you can see I'm focused as close as possible. And then we'll go over and find something to take a photo of. Camera, palm of hand, tips touching lens. I'm going to look through, find what I want and breathe out. Then rock backwards and forwards till I find the point that I want to photograph, find the point that's in focus and snap it. Now, the breathing out before I took that photo is really important because if you're breathing in, what happens is that your body expands, your torso increases as your lungs take in that air, your elbows push out, and it introduces unnecessary movement to the camera. If I breathe out before I take the photo, I'm minimising the amount of movement that my breath is introducing to the photo. So I'm going to go on now and take some more pictures using both natural light and a flash mounted to the hot shoe, whilst you take a look at those photos and then we'll come back and review. I'm now at an area where I've got this lovely bank of buttercups at one side of me with insects in and out of them. And here I've got a pond with some grasses and reeds, and there's dragonflies flying around. So I'm going to stay here and take some photos next. But let's review the photos that I just got in the woods. Before that though, I think it's useful to say, as a macro photographer, you're going to miss a lot of shots. It's a fact of life, you've just got to get used to it. You're not going to hit loads of shots because it's a really difficult thing that you're trying to achieve. When I was starting out doing macro, I used to worry, why can't I hit more shots in focus and get the eye in focus more? But it is difficult. And when you compare it to other types of photography, for example, portraiture, portrait photographers hit focus on the eyeball of the person they're photographing almost all the time. But it's a very different thing. So imagine that you were photographing a person on something, say, the size of a tennis court, and they were running around the tennis court all the time. But at the same time, the tennis court was moving. Well, that's the comparison for what you're doing in macro. You're photographing a little insect that's maybe 3 or 4 millimeters long on a flower head that's maybe 10 centimeters long, and the insect's moving around the flower head, and the flower head is moving in the breeze. So it's a really tricky thing to do. So don't get worried if you're missing lots of shots, everybody does. Now, I've been doing macro for years and I probably still hit 1 in 10, maybe 1 in 9, something like that, with natural light. We'll talk about how you can increase your rate of hitting focus a bit later. So let's review those photos. Now, I use an app to transfer pictures from my camera to my phone so that I can have a look at them in a little bit more detail. Just before I move off and lose an area that maybe had a lot of insects in, that was producing some good photos, I look at them on my phone because the screen is slightly bigger than the camera and you can zoom right in and check the detail. So first, let's start with the spider. Now, it's quite a nice picture. There's a good dynamic range there. It's definitely sharp. You can see the eyes of the spider, but it's perhaps lacking a little bit of detail that I'd quite like. And we'll talk about how to get that detail shortly. Moving on, next there was a bug-like, a bee-like bug. I'm really not sure what this is. If anybody is able to identify that, please tell me, because I'm not sure. I don't think it's a bee, but it's definitely bee-like. Now, when you zoom in, it's sharp, but it's lacking detail, and there's a difference between sharpness and detail. It's sharp, all the edges are clear and in focus around the eye, but when you zoom in, there's no detail. There should be lines crisscrossing that show you the texture of that bug's eye, and that's lacking. So again, we'll come on to that. Next, there's this lovely turquoise coloured bug, and when you zoom in, you can see all the little details in its eye. And how I've achieved that is through using my macro flash. So I've got this almost insect-like thing attached to my camera, and this is my twin macro flash. Now, if you've never seen this before, I'll link to a video up above and down below, which is a previous video I made on macro where I talk about this flash and how to use it. But it's actually the flash that brings out the detail in the eyes, because it's a little bit more light. It's the light that freezes the picture, so I can drop my shutter speed right down and get lots of lovely little details without having to bump up the ISO too much. I think next we've got a picture of a snail shell. Yeah, we've got a snail shell. Now, it's quite a nice picture. You can see some lovely detail, some texture on the shell, but the highlights, where the flash has hit some of the shiny parts of the shell, the highlights are blown out. And there is a technique you can use to soften the light a little bit and make sure you don't get those blown out highlights that you see in that picture. And finally, we had these insects inside this pink flower. And I really quite like this picture. There's a lot of detail on the insect that's on its own, but also you can see right in the middle of the flower, there's a pair of insects mating. So there's quite a lot of detail in that. Now, one of the things that you will notice is that in those photographs that I used flash for, so the green bug and the insect, they both had a black background. You can pick what kind of background you want by changing your shutter speed whilst using the flash. So if I've got a relatively high shutter speed for flash, so 1/250th of a second, which is probably as high as you're going to be able to go using flash, then you'll get quite a dark background because the light will hit the subject but not hit the background before the shutter goes down. But if you use a much slower shutter speed, something like 1/100th or maybe 1/80th of a second, the light should have hit the background as well. So you can choose what you want and you can use that to determine what kind of photo you want. Now, in a wood that I was just in, the backgrounds are all going to be quite busy, so it's useful to make your background as dark as possible because then you lose all of that distracting background image. But in this area where I am now, I'd probably opt for a slower shutter speed to be able to get some nice colours in the background because it's less busy. So let's go on and take some photos here. I've now arrived at the field that I wanted to photograph in. You can see behind me there's loads of wild grass, it's been left to grow wild. There's lots and lots of insects within this and I photograph here quite regularly. But before we go on to take those photos, let's review some of the photos that I got at the ponds. And using those photos, or for those photos, I put these diffusers onto my twin macro flash. Now, they are simply diffusers that are for a speed light, but I find it really useful to just soften the image a little bit. You don't get such harsh lines, you don't get such blown out highlights. It adds quite a nice effect, and they just slip over the ends of this macro flash. I should also mention I regularly take out with me a speed light and use that on top of my camera for places where it's a bit more difficult to get into with those arms of the macro flash. This gives me a little bit more manoeuvrability and I flip between the two. But you don't need to have a twin macro flash. If you've got a speed light, that'll work just as well. Now let's look back at some of those images. So the first one I'm really pleased with, the fly on the buttercup. It let me get a few images of it, but I got one that was face on, and there's tons and tons of detail in the eyes there. I'm really looking forward to getting home and editing that one. And it was the flash that brought it out and the diffuser that helped soften it a little bit so that there's not so many harsh lines on there. Now the next photo that I've got is probably my image of the day so far. A lot of the photos that I've taken for you in this video are to demonstrate a point and get something across. So they're not necessarily that artistic, but this photo really is. I absolutely love it. So we've got a dragonfly on a blade of grass, and it's probably technically close up rather than macro, but it's lovely and it's more artistic. You can see some movement in the grasses in the background. Those parts of the photo are almost abstract, but when you zoom right in, those eyes are perfectly sharp. It's a really lovely photo. I'm very much looking forward to editing that one when I get home. Now next up we've got an interesting photo that I took on the pond. There were some little leaves scattered over the edge of the pond, and dragonflies were flying backwards and forwards. And you've probably seen loads of photos on the internet, or maybe taken some yourself, of dragonflies mating in flight. So the male will grab hold of the female's head, and the female will twist her tail round to join at the male's abdomen, and it makes a heart shape, and they fly around in a heart shape. And there's tons of photos of dragonflies in flight mating. But what they do after mating is what I've captured in this image. So here you can see there's 2 dragonflies on the pond, and the male has still got his tail attached to the female's head. The female's tail is curved round and into the pond, and what she's doing there is depositing her eggs. So some dragonflies, immature dragonflies who've perhaps never mated before, will come along, mate, have their fun, let go of the female's head and fly off. And more experienced dragonflies will know if they come along and grab their head, they can actually, it's rather disgusting, but scrape out the sperm that the previous male dragonfly has deposited in the female, and then they can deposit some of their own. And the experienced dragonfly will hold on to the female until she's deposited the eggs into the water. So it makes sure that he or they will pass on their genes to the next year's dragonflies, and those eggs will sit in the pool until next year, and then they'll come out as dragonflies for the next season. Now, next up, just as I was leaving the pond, I actually found another snail shell. So I took a photo of that one, this time using the twin macro flash with the diffuser on it. So just comparing that to the shot we got before of a snail shell, you can see that there's no blown out highlights, there's no high reflections off the shiny surface. It just brings out the beautiful colours in that snail shell. So the diffusers have really helped in that circumstance. Now, if you've never used flash before, it might seem a little bit intimidating, particularly because as wildlife photographers, we don't often use flash. I would recommend stick on manual. Even if you have TTL or through the lens, you'll find you will learn a lot quicker if you stick to manual and just experiment a little bit to find what works. But as a starting point, I'd say stick your flash on 1/16th power and aim for around 250th of a second shutter speed, and you'll get some nice sharp images with a dark background. And then start to adjust. Maybe move your flash power down a little bit and go from 1/16th to 1/32nd, or even 1/64th, or drop your shutter speed slightly and see what happens. So next I'm going to take some photos in these grasses just behind me, and we'll come back and review afterwards. Let's review those final images that I've taken today. So first up, we've got the dragonfly. Now you can see that that dragonfly is nice and sharp. You can get all the detail from its body, its feathers, but there's no detail in the eye. So although it's sharp, it's lacking detail. And if you compare this image to another dragonfly photo that I've taken today, in fact, it was this morning and it was inside my home. I noticed that a dragonfly had come and landed on the window frame, and I happened to have my camera in my hand with my macro lens on it. So grabbed the twin flash quickly and fired off a couple of photos before it flew away. And there's some really lovely detail in its eye. And I also quite like this because the way I framed it, it's white on white, so it's almost an entirely white picture with just the dragonfly peering around a corner, sort of peekaboo. It's quite a nice picture. But focusing just on the detail, you can see here the difference between not using a flash and using a flash in the eyes of those two dragonflies. So next up, there's a ladybird. So there's a ladybird on one of the grasses just behind me, and you can see some quite nice detail. There's some detail in the grass itself, there's some detail in the ladybird, and this photo was taken using a flash without diffuser. Now, anyone who's taken photos of ladybirds before will know they're notoriously difficult because they've got such shiny shells. In natural light, they actually reflect a lot of the light, and so you end up with big white patches on it. Now, there are a couple of white patches, but they're quite tiny. They are, however, quite defined, and that's because I used a flash without the diffuser. If we move on and look at the second photo of the ladybird, you'll see there that there's no reflection whatsoever. It's a little bit different because the ladybird was under the grass, so it got less natural light on it anyway, but still it shows the point that the diffuser really helps take away some of that harsh light. There's also another ladybird photo that I took, a vertical, as the ladybird was climbing up a blade of grass. And in there you can see some lovely detail in the ladybird's face, and that was brought out by flash and diffuser. Moving on, I found a couple of mating beetles, which makes a quite nice photo. They have some nice detail in the eyes, and interestingly, I then saw a few minutes later the same pair had been joined by a mate. So there was a third one who jumped on back on top of the male for, I don't know, a menage a trois. I didn't know that beetles had that, but somehow they seem to be enjoying themselves. And then the final photo of the day is another fly, which has got some lovely, lovely detail in its eye and around the hairs on the back of its head. And that was taken with flash and diffuser. So let's talk about the key takeaways from this video. So firstly, you want to think about your stance and how you're going to introduce least movement from your body. Arms in, thinking about your breathing, breathe out before you take the photo. How are you actually going to hold the camera so that you can steady it the most? And how are you going to press the shutter so that you introduce least movement to the photo when you do that? They're all things to try and find an answer for yourself, but I've shown you how I do it. Another thing that's probably worth mentioning on that, lots of macro lenses come with built-in stabilisation. And for me, I think it's pretty useless. My lens has got stabilisation on it, and I don't think it does a thing for me in a macro setting. When I use that lens to take photos of people, it's absolutely brilliant, the stabilisation, but I don't think stabilisation helps at all. So if you haven't yet bought a macro lens and you're trying to decide, do I pay a bit more for one with stabilisation or not? I wouldn't bother, because I don't think it's worth it if you're only using that lens for macro. Moving on, next thing to think about is how to get sharpness out of your photo using a flash. So use a speed gun or buy a macro flash, and you'll get some nice definition and increase the sharpness of your photos through using the flash. And if you want to soften that and get some lovely soft light, few cheap diffusers to go over your flash or twin flash will really, really help. So I hope you've enjoyed today, hope you've got a lot from this video, and if you have, please click the like button and don't forget to subscribe so that you get notified next time I put out some content. So until then, thanks very much, and I'll see you next time.